Many years ago, when I was living in Sacramento, my brother came and lived with me for the summer. He was going into his third year of law school at UCLA, and he had been hired as an intern for the summer in the Legal Services Office in Auburn, California. Now, please understand that my brother, John, was born to be a trial attorney. He loves confrontation and argument. And as a side bonus, he is absolutely convinced, at least in the moment of engagement, that his point of view is correct. He is also more liberal than I am, and that is helpful background for this particular story. One day, while living in Sacramento, he and a couple of his friends were walking past the state capitol, and they noticed a fairly large and raucous rally taking place. Their curiosity got the better of them, and they went over to check it out. You see, crowds, as we know, have a tendency to catch our attention. You ever been walking down the street and come across a crowd of people staring at something in the sky, and you just feel drawn to look up and try to see what they're seeing? Anyway, on that particular day, John and his friends had happened upon an NRA rally at the state capitol. The crowd, as crowds tend to do, was getting quite loud and animated. And as the story goes, as soon as John's friends realized what was happening, they both grabbed John and, shall we say, encouraged him to move along. John's first instinct, as we recall how I described my brother, was to get right in there and start yelling back. But his friends, and they were good friends in my estimation, pulled him right out of there. Given the tenor of political rallies and the gathered crowds associated with them, it was the right call. As a reward, they got to hear John as he shared all the things he would have said to the crowds if they had let him engage. And knowing John, I'm sure that was a treat. It's amazing what happens to us when confronted with a crowd. Whether we are a part of the crowd or someone just passing by, it will affect us. For the members of the crowd, they even have a name for it, the mob mentality, but I like to call it the crowd effect. And this is what I believe happens in these situations. The boldness of the crowd rubs off on us, which allows, even encourages us to say or do things we might not otherwise say or do. The safety of the crowd shelters or buffers us for good or for bad, and we start to lose track of our own limits and sometimes our own values. Then the frenzy of the crowd as emotion builds and we as individuals lose sight of who we are and what we think leads us to give in to the mob mentality. And as an added bonus, when we give in to the crowd, in that moment, our relationship to the crowd takes precedence over all else. And those not part of the crowd can far too easily become demonized. It really is amazing what can happen to even the most timid among us in the midst of the crowd. By choice or circumstance, we are given permission to forget ourselves and become one with that crowd. Biblical commentator Peter Woods suggested, be they political supporters, pop idol followers, or sports fans, crowds are at their best when they are cheering on a winner. And this can be a good thing. I imagine the shared joy experienced by the fans of the North Carolina Tar Heels or the South Carolina Gamecocks as their crowd celebrated national titles in college basketball. Or I imagine the excitement and sense of hopefulness that is often present in the midst of political rallies, when our candidate has won and we face a future filled with possibility. Or even, I imagine the people in our gospel story this morning who line the streets to cheer Jesus' arrival in Jerusalem, imagining him to be the long-awaited hero for whom they had been waiting. But the crowd effect is not always so good, and is far too frequently quite the opposite. We recall stories of rioting in places where beloved teams have lost a championship, and sometimes even when they've won. We saw on numerous occasions the ugliness that took place at rallies for various political figures this past election season. And we all know well how the crowds in Matthew's gospel, as Holy Week moves forward, will change their tune. No longer cheering Jesus' arrival, they will soon be calling for his execution. The momentum of the crowd is easily swayed, you see, and we as part of the crowd tend to move with the emotion of the crowd. When it came to the crowds portrayed in Matthew's gospel, they were swayed in part as a result of self-motivated religious leaders, a phenomenon not limited to Jesus' time. But it was more than that. They were betrayed by their own expectations. The crowds, as they're described, are present throughout the Gospel of Matthew, witnessing Jesus' ministry and becoming more excited by the idea that he is the fulfillment of their messianic expectations. Those who cheered as part of the crowd at Jesus' arrival, who were caught up in the emotion of that moment, were fueled by the hope that this long-awaited messianic prophecy was to finally be fulfilled. Audrey West of Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago puts it this way: at his, Jesus' entry into the city, the crowd seemed to recognize that Jesus is the one whom they had been waiting for. And yet, this heir to the throne of David would soon make it crystal clear that he was not quite the Messiah they expected. For immediately after arriving, he made his way to the temple and made quite a scene, challenging the state of the Jewish leadership, even predicting the fall of the temple, a truly sacred place for the Jewish people of his time. And we soon learn that a Jesus who refuses to be an insider, but who always sides with the outsider, as Richard Rohr puts it, will always upset our carefully laid economic tables in status quo scenarios. And when such actions fly in the face of our expectations, our individual sense of disappointment can be fed by the emotion of the crowd. And what was once joy can be turned to anger, even hatred. It was Martin Luther King Jr. who said, "The truth will set you free, as Jesus said, but first, it will make you very angry." And as part of the crowd, as that anger grows and spreads, we can lose ourselves. The great challenge can be not allowing ourselves to give in to this temptation. For if we seek to always be at our best, to be our most authentic selves, it is vital that we always remember who we are amid the crowd. Murray Bowen was an American psychiatrist and professor. He focused much of his research on writing on human behavior, and he developed a theory of behavior that became known as the family systems theory. In short, and I will tell you there is far more to this than I can explore right here, right now, he began by exploring the family as a basic emotional unit. And he developed his entire theory around how individuals within that unit will influence one another and allow themselves to be influenced. One of the core ideas in Bowen's theory is that the family unit seeks to maintain itself at all costs, often to the detriment of the individual. The family will fight all change, which often results in stunted growth for individuals and definitely limits the potential for self-expression. I believe that the crowd frequently operates very much the same way. And so the central challenge in family systems theory is the same challenge when it comes to the crowd. How do I, as an individual, differentiate myself from the crowd? In Matthew's gospel account of Jesus' week in Jerusalem, we witness how easily people fall in line with the crowd, be they cheering his arrival or encouraging his death. Even Peter, who will become a cornerstone of the early Christian church, is swayed by the threat of the crowd, denying his friend and mentor 3 times. In the story, the only one who truly differentiates himself is Jesus. By the way, in Christian applications of family systems theory, Jesus is often cited as the prime example of the self-differentiated person. He, of course, as the story goes, has a better understanding of the overall narrative, and perhaps that helps. Yet each of us has a capacity within us to maintain a sense of self, even amid the emotion of the crowd. Each of us is a gifted and beloved child of God, uniquely created to fulfill our God-given potential, should we avoid falling prey to the pitfalls we will face along the way. This Lenten season, we've been exploring the questions, who am I and who are we? It is my hope that we have each taken the time to consider these questions, and we are developing a better sense of ourselves, in particular in relation to our faith. It is, of course, a lifelong process, and today I might offer this question for your consideration. When the crowd gathers, who am I? And who do I become? Do I stand with the crowd, empowered by the energy captured by the message, but do I lose myself amid the story, becoming a mindless part of the crowd, failing to question what may go against my values? Do I stand against the crowd, emboldened by my individuality, assured by my sense of self and my ideas, but isolated and potentially endangered by my difference? Do I run away from the crowd, afraid of what might happen, afraid of even the potential for controversy and conflict? Or do I find my place in the crowd or against the crowd, confident in my individuality? There will always be crowds, my friends, and not all crowds are bad. Some such crowds maintain a place for self. They are gatherings of like-minded or similarly motivated individuals, and they can resist the lure of becoming a monolithic mob. I mean, our nation could be like a crowd, pushed to ignore actions that we find troubling. But we must then remember our right to express our views. And you could describe those of us gathered in this sanctuary this morning as a crowd. But we are not, I hope, a mindless mob. For we will never encourage uniformity of thought, and we will always encourage individual growth and expression. A colleague of mine, who is now retired, had a sign on his office door. It said, "Think for yourself. Your minister could be wrong." And while I am not sure about the second part of that statement, I think the first part is spot on. Being part of the crowd is not in itself a good or a bad thing. It is all in how we go about it. For we can be empowered by crowds at times, those gatherings of like-minded, encouraging people. We but need to truly know who we are, to maintain our sense of self amid the chaos that may ensue, and to remember that we are, each of us, beloved children of God, empowered with hearts to feel and minds to think. A gathering that encourages that, now that is a crowd of which I am proud to be a part. Amen.